$5,000. For most people, that sounds like the price of a used car. Maybe an old one with a few problems, a lot of miles, and a story the seller would rather not tell you. It does not sound like the price of a brand new electric vehicle. And yet, China has already pushed tiny electric cars into roughly this territory. The 2026 Wuling Hongguang Mini EV, for example, starts around 40,800 yuan in China, roughly $6,000 at current exchange rates. That is not the same thing as a $5,000 car, and that distinction matters. But the direction of travel is impossible to ignore. Because once a new electric car gets close to the price of the cheapest conventional cars, the question changes. It's no longer, can electric vehicles replace expensive gasoline cars? It's something much more uncomfortable. What happens if electric cars start competing for the very bottom of the market? That is where this story gets interesting. Because the biggest threat may not be a futuristic electric sedan with incredible acceleration, a giant battery, or a screen-filled luxury interior. It may be a tiny, simple car that does one thing extremely well. It gets someone from one place to another for as little money as possible. And if that sounds less exciting than a premium EV, that's exactly why you should pay attention. For decades, the cheapest cars in the world were built around a familiar formula: small engine, basic interior, simple technology, low production cost, and as little unnecessary hardware as possible. The goal wasn't to impress the customer, the goal was to make transportation affordable. But electric vehicles were supposed to have a problem here. Batteries are expensive. Electric motors require specialized components. Power electronics cost money, and the entire EV supply chain has to work efficiently before the final vehicle can become genuinely cheap. So how could China possibly push an EV toward the same price territory as some of the cheapest conventional cars? The answer begins with something that doesn't look very exciting at all: the battery. For years, batteries were one of the biggest obstacles standing between electric vehicles and mass affordability. But battery economics have changed dramatically. In 2025, battery prices continued falling, and battery packs in China were significantly cheaper on average than those in North America and Europe. The IEA says China's advantage comes from scale, manufacturing efficiency, supply chain integration, and widespread use of lower-cost LFP battery chemistry. That matters because a battery isn't just another component. It can determine the economics of the entire vehicle. And China has spent years building an enormous industrial ecosystem around batteries. The result is something much deeper than simply cheap batteries. It's a network: battery materials, cell factories, cathode and anode production, motors, electronics, software, metal processing, vehicle assembly, suppliers, logistics. All of these pieces sit relatively close to one another, and that proximity can save time, reduce transportation costs, speed up design changes, and make it easier for manufacturers to experiment. The IEA estimates that China accounted for about 70% of global electric car production and more than 80% of battery cell production in 2025. Now think about what that means. Imagine you're trying to build an inexpensive EV in a market where every battery component has to travel through several layers of suppliers. And then imagine building it inside an ecosystem where many of those suppliers already exist at enormous scale. That difference doesn't sound dramatic until you multiply it by hundreds of thousands or millions of vehicles. And this is where the $5,000 idea starts to become much more interesting. Because the secret isn't necessarily one revolutionary component, it's the accumulation of tiny savings. A cheaper battery, a simpler interior, fewer unnecessary features, a smaller vehicle, a highly optimized production line. Common components, high-volume suppliers, less complexity, and then scale. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the story. People often hear China makes things cheaply and immediately think about cheap labor. But that explanation is far too simple. Modern manufacturing cost is influenced by automation, supplier networks, material prices, factory utilization, engineering experience, logistics, component standardization, and the number of units produced. The more efficiently those pieces work together, the less expensive each individual vehicle can become. And once production reaches a certain scale, something strange happens. The product gets cheaper, which attracts more buyers, which increases production, which gives manufacturers more experience, which can lower costs again. It's a feedback loop. and China has been running that loop across the EV industry at enormous scale, but there's still a problem. A $5,000 or $6,000 mini EV isn't the same as a normal family car. It may have a much smaller battery, less space, less range, lower performance, fewer features, and that is exactly the point. The cheapest EV doesn't need to beat a luxury car. It doesn't even need to beat a large SUV. It only needs to be good enough for someone who doesn't want to spend $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 on transportation. That changes the battlefield completely. Picture a worker who needs a basic vehicle to commute. They don't care about 500 horsepower. They don't need a panoramic roof. They don't need a massive entertainment system. They need something affordable, reliable, and cheap to operate. If an electric vehicle can satisfy those needs at a price close to a conventional entry-level car, the conversation changes. And suddenly, the biggest competition isn't Tesla versus another premium EV. It isn't even China versus America. It's a battle between two completely different ideas of what a cheap car should be. The old idea says, take an existing automobile, remove expensive features, shrink the engine, cut costs wherever possible, and sell it cheaply. The new idea asks, what if we design the entire vehicle around electric propulsion from the beginning? That's the deeper disruption, because electric motors have fewer moving parts than internal combustion engines, and a small EV can be designed around a much simpler mechanical system. The challenge has always been the battery. But if battery costs keep falling, the economics of the entire vehicle can begin shifting with them, and that creates a problem for traditional automakers. Not because they don't know how to build cars, they absolutely do. The problem is that established automakers have enormous systems built around selling cars at much higher prices. Factories, dealerships, labor structures, compliance costs, brand expectations, engineering standards, distribution networks. And customers who expect a certain level of equipment. A giant automaker can't simply look at a tiny Chinese EV and say, let's build that. The vehicle might be easy to copy. The economics are much harder to copy. That's the part many people miss. A cheap car isn't just a collection of cheap parts. It's a cheap system, and systems are difficult to reproduce. This is also where the American side of the story becomes important. The United States has enormous automotive expertise, advanced technology, powerful companies, and a massive consumer market. But its auto industry has generally moved toward larger, heavier, more expensive vehicles. That isn't necessarily irrational. Americans often want larger vehicles. Manufacturers can earn more from them, and the economics of the market have encouraged that direction. But imagine what happens if another manufacturer becomes extremely good at serving the opposite customer, the person who wants the least expensive new vehicle possible. That creates a strange strategic problem. American companies could protect the market with trade barriers. They could build domestic supply chains. They could redesign vehicles. They could invest in cheaper batteries. They could try to create their own low-cost EV platforms. But every option has a cost, and consumers have their own priorities. If one vehicle is cheaper, simpler, and inexpensive to operate, some buyers will want it. That doesn't mean Chinese EVs automatically take over every market. They won't. Different countries have different safety standards, tariffs, charging systems, consumer preferences, and industrial policies. And a vehicle that is inexpensive in China can become much more expensive after shipping, taxes, regulations, distribution, and local requirements. That's why the $5,000 figure should not be treated as a universal global retail price. The real story is the direction of the economics, and that direction is powerful. Because China isn't only producing cheaper batteries, it is producing cars at extraordinary scale while continuing to push down manufacturing costs. The IEA estimates that lower powertrain costs explain a large portion of the manufacturing cost advantage of Chinese EVs compared with advanced economies, with battery prices and manufacturing efficiency playing major roles. Now imagine that advantage moving into more markets: Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, parts of Europe, markets where the biggest question isn't, what is the most advanced car I can buy? But, what is the cheapest reliable transportation I can afford? That is a much larger market, and it creates an uncomfortable possibility. The future of EVs may not be driven only by wealthy consumers buying expensive technology. It may be driven by ordinary consumers buying very simple transportation. That's when the story becomes much bigger than cars, because affordable transportation changes economies. It changes how far people can travel for work. It changes delivery businesses. It changes household budgets. It changes fuel demand. It changes which companies control supply chains. And eventually, it can change which countries control manufacturing capacity. That is why governments are watching this so closely. China's advantage isn't unlimited and it isn't permanent. Battery prices can rise, raw material costs can change, trade barriers can increase. Other countries can build competing factories, technology can shift, and Chinese manufacturers themselves are under enormous competitive pressure. But there is one thing that is difficult to reverse: experience. When an industry produces millions of batteries and millions of vehicles, manufacturers learn. They make fewer mistakes. They improve factories, they redesign components, they negotiate better with suppliers, they automate more. They move faster and those improvements accumulate. That may be the real story behind the $5,000 EV. Not one miracle car, not one miracle battery, not one company, an industrial learning curve. And if that curve continues downward, the consequences could be enormous, because the cheapest car market is not a small corner of the automobile industry. It is where millions of people enter the world of personal transportation. For decades, the industry assumed that making a car cheaper meant making a conventional car simpler. China is testing another idea. What if the cheaper car is built around a different technology entirely? That is the question nobody can answer with certainty yet. Maybe ultra-cheap EVs remain tiny city cars. Maybe tariffs and regulations keep them out of major markets. Maybe other countries catch up. Or maybe the price floor keeps falling until the definition of an affordable new car changes completely. And if that happens, the biggest disruption won't be that China sells a $5,000 electric car. It will be that the entire industry discovers the old price of a basic car was never a permanent law. It was simply the result of a particular manufacturing system. Change the system, and you can change the price. That's why the $5,000 number matters, not because every family in America will suddenly buy a $5,000 Chinese EV, not because every gasoline car is about to disappear. And not because one country is guaranteed to win the global automobile race. It matters because it points toward something much more powerful: the possibility that electric transportation is finally moving from an expensive technology story into a mass-market affordability story. And once that happens, the question is no longer who makes the best electric car. It's much harder than that. Who can make the cheapest car without making it too cheap to want? Because if China solves that problem at scale, the next battle in the automobile industry may not happen at the top. It may begin at the bottom, and that is where millions of customers are waiting.